Okay, why don't we get started? Good afternoon. I'm Darrell West. I'm Vice President and Director of Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, and I would like to welcome you to a discussion of democracy in the age of new media. The last decade has been a revolutionary time in the history of the American media. We have seen the rise of 500 television channels, the emergence of talk radio, and the development of the Internet. Now, the advent of this 24-hour news cycle has created a noisy media environment that has complicated our nation's ability to handle a wide range of issues, from healthcare and the deficit to religion and politics. But I think it's fair to say that few topics have been more challenging than the debate over immigration. It is a topic that divides many people, and it is one that has been very difficult for reporters and analysts to cover, and for Congress, the President, and courts to resolve. Today, we are releasing a report on the media and immigration that helps us understand media coverage and public opinion regarding immigration. This project is a partnership between Brookings and the Norman Lear Center at the University of Southern California. It has been a great relationship that I think everybody has enjoyed and benefited from. I want to point out that financial support for this project has been provided by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the ARCA Foundation of Washington, D.C. And I believe with us today from Carnegie is Jerry Mannion. Jerry, are you here? We really appreciate Jerry's help and advice on this work. And then also joining us today from the ARCA Foundation are the president of that organization, Nancy Bagley, the former executive director, Donna Edwards, and the current executive director, Anna Leffen-Kuhn. And we're grateful for the support and counsel provided by ARCA as well. Now I would like to introduce Martin Kaplan, the director of the Norman Lear Center. Marty is a research professor at the USC Annenberg School for Communications. He holds the Norman Lear Chair on Entertainment, Media, and Society. He's been a Washington journalist, a White House speechwriter, a deputy presidential campaign manager, a screenwriter, a studio executive, and many other things. And so I think all of that gives him great credibility to discuss our topic for today. So it is my pleasure to turn the podium over to Marty.
Thank you. This idea began in a conversation between Strobe Talbot at Brookings and Jeff Cowan, who was then the dean of the Annenberg School. And the goal was to ask the question, how do we do democracy in the age of new media? And the two people who got to carry out the plan were EJ and myself in a collaboration. If you think of a kind of crude triangle of the people who make laws, the elected legislators and the policy analysts who work with them is one point of the triangle, of the media as a second, and as a third, public opinion and organized interest groups and elections themselves as ways of expressing public points of view. The question is, what happens when media become, as Darrell just described, new media, when new standards and practices of journalism as well as new distribution outlets for journalism arise? How does that affect the way we deliberate, especially on contentious issues? We came up with a shopping list of a number of contentious issues. They included health, and energy and entitlements and immigration, and we were fortunate enough that the first one that got funded was immigration, and Jerry Mannion and ARCA were our angels, and so we were able to produce the case study that you have today. This conversation and discussion has two acts. The first act is a presentation and summary by the people who worked on the materials. They are up here. And the second act is a discussion of their work that includes them, but also includes other voices. I'm going to introduce the people who are up here with me, who wrote the sections of today's piece. But let me introduce them in terms of the data that they work from. This is an empirical study. And there are three sets of data that were worked from. The first was the work of the Project on Excellence in Journalism. Thanks to Tom Rosenstiel, they do a news index which looks at a broad range of outlets and does content analysis. And we are fortunate enough to have an index methodologist from the Project on Excellence in Journalism who has done a detailed analysis on immigration focused on the year 2007, a key year in the immigration debate. And she has a doctorate from Temple University. Please welcome Banu Atkanizli.
Thank you.
No. A second set of data is public opinion research. And there we are able to draw on, thanks to Andy Kohut and others at the Pew Research Center, data that the Pew Research Center and the Pew Hispanic Center, and also Gallup data and new data that was generated by Pew for the purposes of this, public opinion data stretching from 2001 to 2007. And the person who did that analysis of the data is an old friend who has at least three hats at Georgetown, at Brookings, and is a syndicated columnist at the Washington Post. If you look at the titles of his books, you have a kind of a tour of American public life in the last couple of decades, ranging from Why Americans Hate Politics to They Only Look Dead, Why Progressives Will Dominate the Next Political Era. Please welcome E.J. Dionne. The third set of data was an original set of analysis which was commissioned by the analyst and lead report writer at the USC Annenberg School. They looked at data, news content from 1980 to 2007, and the outlets they analyzed in that large period: New York Times, USA Today, 4 regional papers, the AP, other wire services, 3 broadcast networks, NPR, 5 political blogs. And not only was that analyzed, but so also was the work that Banu and EJ did. And the person who led that data collection at Annenberg and who analyzed them all and wrote the lead report in the document you have today is someone who certainly knows journalism, given his life at the Chicago Sun-Times, the Chicago Tribune, Time Magazine, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He was the founding director of the Pew Hispanic Center and is now a professor at the USC Annenberg School for Communication. Please welcome Roberto Suro. So I'm going to ask Roberto a question, and he's going to lead off the conversation. And that is, what has the coverage of the immigration debate been, and how has that coverage actually affected the deliberation on immigration policy?
Thank you. And that's a simple question, which you can read the report. I'll try and summarize the answer very quickly. I mean, to give you the bottom line on the second question, my conclusion is that the media coverage over a long period of time has actually made it more difficult to produce policy on immigration, simply to make the wheels of government turn and produce some kind of resolution. Immigration policy turned out to be a really superb subject for this kind of a case study for a variety of reasons. One, that there have been successive rounds of policymaking or attempted policymaking over the course of 3 decades, and the terms of those debates haven't changed very much. Having covered immigration since 1974, and having committed all of the sins ascribed to the media in this report, it's remarkable how repetitious the subject, especially in terms of policy making, is. We're all talking about the same stuff. So those of us who follow it continuously have had these discussions now for a long, long time, which actually made it easy to do a case study, because the terms of the debate haven't changed that much, and the actual yield in policy making has progressively declined. During the course of that time, we've had all the changes in the media landscape that we've talked about, and also a great change in the immigrant population due to its growth and change. And the end result has been almost universal dissatisfaction with the state of policy. It's one of these areas in which the one point of absolute agreement for people from virtually every point of the spectrum is that the status quo is unsatisfactory. So my task was trying to understand how the media contributed to that outcome. And it's not, we're not making the claim that it was a decisive influence, but it certainly played a role. And I think the findings sort of come in a couple of broad categories, and looking at the progression of time and how the change in the media has affected this interaction with policy. There are several tendencies that are evident going back a long time that relate to the basic epistemological framework which drives a lot of American journalism, and sort of really deeply ingrained habits of the way we, and I still think of myself as a journalist, look at the world and describe it to people. As the media landscape has changed, some of those tendencies have become exaggerated in a way that's particularly noticeable in the coverage of immigration. And finally, in this last round of policymaking, we saw, I think, a very important demonstration of a new phenomena in the relationship of media writ large, and policymaking, that reflects an idea that Henry Jenkins, the media scholar at MIT, has called convergence. And I'll talk about each of those separately, and a convergence in a way that had a profound impact on the policymaking. In the tendencies, these basic tendencies that are evident throughout all of the coverage and have become exaggerated in recent years, one is very episodic attention to immigration. The report shows how the volume of coverage rises and falls quite dramatically over years. In describing a phenomenon that has been much more steady and continuous, and this kind of coverage has been shown to create a mindset in the public that reacts to sudden surges of coverage associating the subject with crisis, controversy, with something dramatic happening, when the underlying phenomena has been really quite uneventful. The arrival of millions of people here, mostly through legal channels, mostly going about their business, and the overall change has been gradual, while the coverage has been very episodic, very dramatic, and driven by breaking news events. Immigration is classically the kind of story that one great newspaper editor called an oozer. And it oozes, it doesn't break. It happens slowly over time, and these are stories that American journalism has a great deal of trouble describing. The other important tendency is a penchant to focus on acts of illegality, something which is an age-old tendency in journalism. It's not just that the man biting a dog is news rather than vice versa. If either the man or the dog is a felon, particularly if the dog is a felon, it's a much better story. And in this case, the focus in a phenomenon that for the most part over time has been one of legal entry, the coverage has focused rather relentlessly on acts of illegality by immigrants or the government efforts to control illegality. And this skews the picture of the larger phenomena in important ways, I believe. And finally, there has been a tendency to focus on immigrants and sometimes government actors and advocates as the major protagonists in this drama, to the exclusion of other important actors. And this has decontextualized the whole story of immigration, which is intimately related to the way our economy has developed, to the demography of the country, to a whole series of other externalities that have gotten lost. All of these tendencies have become exaggerated in the recent period that has transformed the media through the arrival of cable television, the internet, talk radio, and other developments have exaggerated the episodic nature of coverage, the tendency to flood the zone and then abandon a story, the focus on illegality and very dramatic elements of a story, and the lack of contextual coverage. All of these things kind of came together in 2006. As I said, in this sort of borrowing this idea from Henry Jenkins of convergence, where you had classic mainstream media, big corporation media, grassroots types of media, both playing off the story in two episodes. The immigrant marches on one side in 2006, and then a very substantial backlash against the Senate bill in 2007 from the other side of the debate, where you saw the public using a lot of different types of media, talk radio, ethnic radio, big corporate media, grassroots communications, advocacy groups mixed into this picture, creating a kind of brood response to a public policy activity that then feeds back on Washington in a very powerful way. And that, if it's becomes a set piece of policy making, will have very substantial implications for the future. Thank you.
2007, of course, was the year that the comprehensive immigration reform grand bargain died, which makes it an ideal study for media analysis. Banu looked at, and her colleagues looked at 5 media sectors: cable talk, radio talk, newspapers, radio, and network TV, emerging from 48 outlets and analyzing 70,737 stories. What did you find?
Thank you. Yes, at PEJ we do analyze 48 outlets daily from 5 media sectors, and this gives us about 1,300 stories per week. And when you look at that, that actually equals the size of a full academic study every week. And for the year 2007, our universe was more than 70,000 stories. And the most important thing that we found on the topic of immigration was that American media did not cover immigration as a topic continuously. Media's tendency to flood the zone with instant coverage and then quickly drop the subject was evident in immigration as well. We see over the months that a sudden surge came in May and June, in which the numbers rose dramatically compared to the rest of the year. And when we looked closely, we saw that coincided with the May 17 announcement of the compromise bill among the Senate and the White House and its defeat on June 28. It was the top story over all media sectors at the same time, meaning it was the top story in cable, network, radio, online, and newspapers. More dramatically, for the period of May 17 to June 28, we see talk radio hosts and cable TV talk hosts had the highest amount of coverage. It was 31% for the radio talkers and 19% for the cable TV talk hosts. This is actually magnified in significance when you take talk as a group out of the overall index numbers. While it was number one with talk, when we take that out of the universe, immigration drops to the third biggest story from May 17 to June 28. Among all of the cable talkers, the one who was clearly devoted to the cause of immigration we saw was CNN's Lou Dobbs. And we sort of expected that. While throughout the whole year, immigration was his top story at 22%, we see that during that time, he devoted 44% almost of the entire news hole to the immigration bill coverage. On Fox, we saw Bill O'Reilly, more than any other of his counterparts. MSNBC really didn't do much because for them, just as the rest of the year, the Iraq War and the presidential campaign was much more of an agenda. Outside of this period, in terms of talking generally for cable, in the year 2007, we see that during the nighttime, policy and legislation discussion in regards to immigration. But during the day, we see more stories on immigrant crime, rally, and protests. Examples: live May Day rallies from Chicago and Los Angeles, ICE raids, illegal border crossing stories were some of the typical examples of the day fare. And for talk radio, we see most significantly that immigration as an issue is on the agenda more for conservative talk radio hosts than it is for the liberals. When we look at the specific time from between May and June for the immigration legislation bill in the Senate, we see that 31% of the conservative talk radio hosts were covering this issue, while as the liberals were only devoting 3% of their time. And when you look at it, even for the rest of the year, for example, Randy Rhoads didn't devote any time to the immigration topic in the period that in the airtime that we studied. Of all the media sectors, besides talk radio and cable talk, we see that newspapers had a special role. The immigration as a topic was consistently present. It did increase in May and June as much as the others, but here we see there was an effort to track immigration as a topic that ebbed and flowed throughout the year. And the emphasis in our findings for print are actually is a little bit more enlarged, because at PEJ we only consider the front page of every newspaper that we analyze. So the prominence is there. I mean, if obviously it's going to be included in our study if it's on the front page, the prominence there is elevated. And we saw for national, regional, and local newspapers that the newspapers did actually devote staff to this issue. Most all of the stories that were written by local internal staff. And actually, what I wanted to, one thing is that network and online did not give a lot of prominence to immigration even during the May 17, June 28th period. But I thought what was interesting, and that we don't have in the report, was what I wanted to give you some updated numbers on immigration for the year 2008. And so I looked into January 1st to August 31, and we see that immigration, unfortunately, has dropped to the seventh big story from its fourth big story slot in 2007. There's only 1% of coverage. The year has been dominated so far by the presidential campaign. Even for talk radio hosts, we see that the campaign is at 61%, and immigration, unfortunately, is at 0.3%. And it's at the 16th place for conservative talk radio hosts who were so, when immigration was so much on their agenda in 2007. In 2008, we don't see that. Thank you.
Thanks, Banu. My favorite data point from that study is that on MSNBC, immigration was not in the top 10 stories for the evening programs, but during the daytime, it was fourth, just behind Anna Nicole Smith. Next, we're going to look at the analysis of public opinion that EJ did, and so the challenge is to look at the relationship between what Americans think about immigration and how that correlates to the particular news media that those people consume. EJ?
Thank you very much, Marty, and I am so glad Roberto, my old friend, still thinks of himself as a journalist. If you're a journalist or a Red Sox fan, or for many of us a Catholic, those things stay with you always. So bless you. I really enjoyed marinating myself in these numbers. Somebody once wrote a book about polling called Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics, and what I concluded is that there is such a profound ambivalence in the public on this issue that you can prove almost anything you want with immigration polling. There is either no majority or there are multiple majorities. And I think this ambivalence explains why it is so difficult to reach any sort of consensus. It's to paraphrase what Barney Frank said, if the politicians are no great shakes, we citizens are no great shakes either. We are very confused, in some cases sensibly confused, about this issue and about where we should stand. Let me just give you an example of two majorities. This is from a study by Stan Greenberg, Quinlan Rosner. The restrictionists in the room will be glad to know that 52% of Americans in this survey wanted to deport all illegal immigrants. However, 64% in the same survey wanted to allow illegal immigrants who pay a fine and learn English to be eligible to apply for citizenship. This is in the same survey. And to give you from the same survey, just to give you a sense of how divided people are in the services they want to give, 74% favored public schools from kindergarten through high school for the children of illegal immigrants who are American citizens. But only 50% favored public schools, K through high school, for children who are here illegally, and only 35% wanted to send them to college at in-state tuition rates. Yes, 64% favored letting illegal immigrants use hospitals and emergency room, but only 25% wanted to give them Medicaid. And say a prayer for Hillary Clinton, only 31% approve of driver's licenses for illegal immigrants. That gives you a sense of this profound ambivalence, and I think this ambivalence really does make it difficult for policymakers to solve this problem. I do want to thank Andy Kohut and Scott Keeter of Pew and also Frank Newport and Maura Strasberg of Gallup, who made available enormous amounts of data to us, and thanks to Dominique Melisinos for helping me go through all this. In the Pew surveys, we wanted to look at the talk radio effect and the Lou Dobbs effect. And Banu's study, I really, as well as Roberto's, I really urge you to spend time with, because I think when you look at that period of immigration, it's quite clear that while conservative and restrictionist voices were very mobilized outside of the Latino community, which was very mobilized, the liberal voices were not mobilized on this issue at that time. The most fascinating thing about our study of Dobbs and talk radio is that they didn't affect everybody. If you simply looked at the top line, and we used a question about favoring path to citizenship or amnesty, Andy split his sample to ask the question both ways, and we combined the results. There was no difference between those who regularly relied on talk radio for information and those who didn't. However, among conservative Republicans, there was an enormous difference. Conservative Republican talk radio listeners, 54% opposed a path to citizenship. Among conservative Republicans who didn't listen to talk radio, 62% favored a path to citizenship, a real clear difference. Now, there is a methodological problem about the chicken and the egg. Are the people who listen to talk radio more inclined that way or not? But somehow there is a talk radio effect. Lou Dobbs, we found the same thing. that if you look at the public as a whole, there is no difference between Lou Dobbs viewers and non-Lou Dobbs viewers. However, Lou Dobbs had his main impact on conservative and moderate Democrats. Among conservative and moderate Democrats, 52% of Lou Dobbs listeners opposed a path to citizenship. Among conservative and moderate Democrats who didn't rely on Dobbs for information, 59% favored. Less dramatic than the split among conservatives, but a very definable difference. And if you were on the restrictionist side of this debate, and if you were going to plan a division of labor, the two groups you would most want to influence are conservative Republicans and moderate to conservative Democrats, because they were the key swing votes in the immigration debate. And so I think that is a very important finding. I also argue, and I may get into this a little later in the questions, that there is a very big difference between how this issue plays nationwide and how it plays district by district, because the Latino population is not distributed equally among congressional districts. So again, swing districts tend to have a lower Latino population, and so it plays differently at the state and the district level. And so the final point is simply this, that in an environment where Americans are genuinely ambivalent, and often I say intelligently ambivalent, they're torn about the injustice that they see in having illegal immigrants here and the failures of government. They see that as something to oppose. But majorities also want to solve this problem, and they also look at our immigration tradition as a positive thing for the country. In this ambivalent environment, a lot of forces play a big role, but the media surely play an extremely important role. And so my part of the study shows why you got to read all that Roberto and Banu wrote in the front of the study. Thank you.
So I get to ask one question of each of the authors about something that interested me in their report, just to expand on it. And I'll start with you, Roberto. You talked about the focus on illegal immigration, that immigration itself is a much larger picture, and employers and consumers are part of that. Would you expand on that?
Yeah, I think if you're trying to portray the whole of this phenomena, it needs to be contextualized to understand what the economic forces are that attract people here, the demographic forces that have created that demand, rather than seeing if immigration is portrayed as an act committed by immigrants solely and detached from all the other elements of the social and economic elements that produce it. A number of things happen. One, in policy terms, people will then tend to think that if you act on the immigrants, you can solve the problem, without looking at the much larger panoply of social actors that bring about the immigration you're trying to control, especially employers. So the notion is, if we can stop them from coming in, we control the phenomenon, because you have focused simply on them. And this coverage is focused very highly on the border in particular. And the second is, if over time you tell this story over and over again, even in positive terms, of the struggling immigrant who's come here to better their life and crosses the desert and comes here and finds a job and does well, raises a family, all that stuff achieves the American dream. Story told thousands and thousands of times over the last 30 years. If you create that kind of protagonism, that it's this person doing this quite independently to us, and perceptions of immigration turn negative, then the tendency is to see the immigrants as the villains and the population as victims, when in fact we as a society played a very substantial role in creating this situation. We are the primary actors here in creating the immigrant situation, whether you like it or not. You have to take responsibility for it. And the media has made it very easy for the American public to think it has no responsibility in this situation.
The role of Spanish talk radio in mobilizing a national demonstration is something discussed in the papers, but in addition, there's an interesting analysis in the paper that Banu wrote, which describes the differences and similarities between Spanish language broadcast news and newspapers and English language. Could you describe that?
Sure.
And it's Banu, not Banu.
Sure. As a supplement to all of this study, all of this, these numbers, there was also a little snapshot study that was done by one of our colleagues at PEJ, and she looked into English language network news, ABC, NBC, CBS, and she considered American newspapers, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. And for Spanish language media, she looked into El Diario, La Opinión, El Nuevo Herald, and for broadcast, she was looking into Telemundo and Univision. From June 25 to 29, during that week, we saw that English language network news compared to Spanish language media gave significant less coverage to the immigration bill. They had only 8 stories, which is actually not that atypical because for the rest of the year, immigration was not one of their top 10 stories, both in morning or evening network news. For Telemundo and Univision, we see 18 stories compared to the 8 in the English language media. When we look at newspapers, we see that the English language media actually covered more. They had 37 stories compared to the 22. But here, the difference is that only 14 of those English language stories were on the front page, compared to the Spanish ones, 15 were on the front page. So again, there's a difference in prominence. And in a very qualitative sort of general assessment that was done, we saw that English language media was more focused on the politics of the bill, the winners and the losers in the Senate, while the Spanish language media tended to focus more on the immigrants themselves, the ramifications of the bill on the ethnic community, and even in the reporting we saw that, especially for broadcast, the reporters themselves would announce their feelings and their own opinions regarding the bill.
EJ, you tantalized us with a brief mention of the way in which this issue plays out in congressional districts and in Senate races. Can you expand on that?
Yes, and thank you. I'm just going to stay here if the folks down the end don't mind. Are these mics on? Can you
push the button.
Oh, there we go. Wow. It's another way to ask the same question is not only about Senate races, but also why isn't it a bigger issue right now in the presidential race? And I think that what I did is I looked at, on the one hand, congressional districts that were swing districts. You can define those in a lot of ways. I looked at, from the 2006 results, the 34 most competitive Democratic-held seats, the ones that are likely to be very contested this year. In those 34 seats, there are only 4 in which the Hispanic population is more than 18%. In 19 of them, the Hispanic population is less than 3%, and in the bulk of them, it's on the low end rather than the high end. What this means is that in congressional elections in swing districts, a pro-immigration position, and I know these are loose terms, but in a broad sense, a pro-immigration position could be more controversial, or to put it another way, you don't get the help from the Latino votes that you would in those districts, or you don't get punished by the Latino vote if you took a broadly anti-immigration position. Whereas in the presidential election, at the state level, Latinos are very important. Take swing states in this election: Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, and if John McCain weren't from Arizona, it would be Arizona. New Mexico, 20% Latino. Colorado, 17% Latino. New Mexico, 43%. Arizona, 25%. So that a Republican candidate in a congressional district or a conservative Democrat like Heath Shuler in North Carolina might well want to take a restrictionist position, but John McCain does not want to get on the wrong side of this issue, and indeed, historically, he hadn't been. He got ambivalent about it during the Republican primaries, to be charitable. He does not want to get on the wrong side of the Hispanic vote. So this issue plays out, I think, very differently at the congressional level, particularly the House level, versus the Senate and presidential level. I'm going to take 20 seconds to mention one thing that I didn't mention, which is I looked at a lot of numbers comparing African Americans, whites, and Latinos, and I think it's very important to realize that African Americans, in their attitudes, are very much are more like white Americans than like Latino Americans. There's a lot of uneasiness among African Americans about immigration, partly because they are genuinely worried about the impact on wages and competition among those who, many of whom find themselves at the bottom of the economy. African Americans are by no means more hostile on these questions to immigration than whites are, but they are much more like whites, and you saw evidence of a certain number of African American talk show hosts, and black radio is a very important medium in our country, who took a rather tough line on immigration. I think that's something that we're going to, we as a society, those interested in the media, are going to have to look at over time.
A complicated ballet is about to take place right before your eyes. I'm going to ask the other panelists, but not the moderator, to join me up here.